And joining us now to discuss President Trump's remarks at the United Nations General Assembly and the Chinese Communist Party's influence in the United Nations is Alex Newman, award-winning international journalist, educator, and author as well. Good afternoon to you, Alex. So President Trump said yesterday at the UN that it has a lot of potential, but hasn't lived up to that potential. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, if you go back to the early history of the United Nations, one of the key agendas by the people who created it, including multiple agents for Joseph Stalin, including an American who was later arrested and thrown in prison, Alger Hiss, served as the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter and later the first Secretary General. Their agenda was always to create a one world system that is political and economic in nature. And so from that perspective, I think the potential of the UN is really rather dangerous. Now, one of the things that Trump did during his speech was systematically dismantle the UN's own raison d'etre, right? On paper, at least, the United Nations exists to promote peace and stop war. And as the president pointed out, I think very correctly, it has not done that. In fact, the president himself said he has ended 7 wars within his first year in office in the second term. The United Nations was not involved in any of those. So I think the president was making nice comments to try to be friendly with the Secretary General and the senior leadership there. But he understands, as well as I think many Americans do, that we have a real problem when it comes to this organization. It is not interested in peace. It has a much more sinister agenda.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. And what do you think about Trump saying that the UN is actually supporting uncontrolled migration? He said that too as well.
He is 100% correct. In fact, the Epoch Times did a documentary that I helped Josh Phillip with. It was a very, very good documentary. I encourage those who haven't watched it to go check it out. This is a critical issue. And the way Trump phrased this, I think, really deserves to be heard. He called this a globalist assault on the West, and in particular on the borders of the Western world. And he pointed out that this was not just a bad policy idea. This was just not just misguided idealism. This was part of a deliberate agenda to undermine the Western world. And as he said repeatedly throughout his remarks, a lot of this is actually for the direct benefit of the Chinese Communist Party, whether we're talking about the green energy scam, as he referred to it, whether we're talking about the mass immigration. The primary beneficiary of this whole fiasco is the CCP. The UN knows that. The senior leadership of the UN knows that. The CCP knows that. And Trump knows that. Unfortunately, many Western leaders don't seem to understand that yet. But you saw a lot of clapping after his remarks. I think awareness is growing.
You mentioned the Chinese Communist Party, and you know what's crazy to me? As you know, China and Cuba sit on the UN Human Rights Council, right? How does the council have credibility when those countries who are accused of torture, persecution, or even forced organ harvesting hold voting power?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is something that I have been pointing out for well over a decade in my reporting in the New American Magazine and also in the Epoch Times. I did a piece a few years ago in the opinion pages of the Epoch Times pointing out that the CCP and a lot of these autocratic regimes have a very different understanding of human rights than Americans do. In the United States, our Declaration of Independence says God gives us rights and government exists to protect those rights: life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. The UN's understanding of rights can be understood just from reading its documents, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 29 says none of these rights and privileges can ever be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. It's a radical redefinition of rights. And so that's why the CCP, that's why mass murdering dictatorships can sit on this Human Rights Council and pretend to be all in favor of human rights, while simultaneously criticizing a country like the United States, Western countries, for clinging to real rights. It's very perverse, but I would urge people to consider the fact that this is very deliberate. This is an effort to reframe rights, not as something that is unalienable, something that precedes and supersedes government, but rather as a privilege that the government in its kindness gives you and that the government in its wisdom can take away at any time.
And Alex, can you talk to us as well about what specific or diplomatic tools or economic tools does Beijing use to influence the UN?
Well, it's been doing this for a very long time. They have a school of global governance in Beijing where they're training up thousands of operatives to infiltrate the United Nations. And we've seen this very openly, right? Normally, when someone goes to work for the UN, they take an oath to the international organization and promise to renounce their political parties at home and even the interests of their own nation. the CCP has been very clear that any member of the CCP who goes to work in the UN must obey the CCP. When Meng Hongwei was arrested, he was the head of Interpol back when he visited China again. He was supposed to have diplomatic immunity. One of the things that the CCP said about him was that he wasn't obeying the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party. Why we would have a CCP card-carrying member running the global law enforcement agency, or at least the wannabe global law enforcement agency, is something that I think people really ought to be asking themselves. But CCP operatives, including card-carrying members of this terrorist criminal organization, are at the highest levels of the UN across its 15 specialized agencies, and they now dominate huge swaths of policymaking in this global institution.
And Alex, you wrote about this as well. So I wanted to ask you something specific about the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. How has the CCP embedded itself within UNESCO's leadership and key initiatives, for example, like Education 2030?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a problem that goes all the way back to the founding of UNESCO. You have had communists from China and from other countries in the leadership going back to the very beginning. Now, if you look more recently, at this moment, one of the top deputies of UNESCO is a card-carrying member of the CCP. The leader is a publicly declared socialist, and the previous leader was a publicly declared communist, Irina Bokova. She was a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She actually served in a senior role as this regime was slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and they almost promoted her to UN Secretary General. So what the UNESCO is doing is it's putting communist Chinese propaganda and communist propaganda generally in the education systems of countries around the world. And the danger of that cannot be emphasized strongly enough. We're talking about the next generation of leaders, political, business, and otherwise, and they're being indoctrinated as we speak with this kind of propaganda. Thankfully, Donald Trump has announced that we're leaving from this, but the head of UNESCO publicly responded and said, well, we're going to keep working with our American partners anyway. So it's a big threat.
So, Alex, I told our reporters earlier about this. The United Nations, again, denied press credentials to several reporters from 2 U.S. media companies, the Epoch Times and us, NTD, right? How can it justify barring these companies from covering its meetings? I mean, we're simply exercising our fundamental rights to a free press.
This shows you the influence of the CCP. There is no doubt in my mind that this was an instruction from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I do go to many of these UN meetings. I was at the UN General Assembly, the Summit of the Future last year. I go to the UN climate summits every year. I'll be at the one in Brazil in just a couple of months. And I do occasionally submit articles to the Epoch Times from these meetings. But what we see is when a government is powerful enough, they can dictate policy at the UN. We saw the Canadian government get rebel media banned from there because they asked tough questions about climate change. So this shows you the corruption that exists within the UN, where it's taking its orders from a murderous regime, from a murderous political party. And it shows, I think it should show Americans very clearly that this is not an institution that's aligned with our values. It's not an institution that's aligned with the values that our country was founded on. That makes it extremely dangerous.
So the Epoch Times editor-in-chief said, quote, "The Epoch Times is America's 4th largest newspaper. It is unacceptable that the United Nations caves to the Chinese Communist Party's censorship efforts on American soil." Can you talk a bit more on this?
Yeah, it's an absolute abomination. I, of course, will be raising these concerns with my contacts within the Trump administration. But I think if we don't push back here and now, we're going to see much more of this. They have tried to deny me press credentials in the past. This is very deliberate. They don't like real questions being asked there. And so we need to understand that this is a symptom of a much broader disease. It's not just that they won't allow a particular set of reporters in. This goes to the heart of what the United Nations is. It's a tool, unfortunately, in many cases, for totalitarians, for people who are completely opposed to everything that our country stands for. And I do hope that the Trump administration will push back very forcefully on this. The U.S. taxpayer remains the single largest source of funds for this entire organization and its affiliates. And so the Trump administration needs to use what U.S. influence there is still to push back on this immediately.
Okay, Alex, it was so great to hear your comments today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.